Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Fighting on Film podcast. Now, today we're away from the cinema queue. We turn off our streaming platforms and we button up our DPM jackets and step back to the early 80s, and we take a look at two British Army of the Rhine training films. And we are joined with a special guest, Dr. Kenton White, who's a historian and lecturer at the University of Reading, and he's just about to release a book about NATO's defence strategy called Never Ready. Welcome to the show, Kenton.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Thrilled to have you here. So listeners of last week's show will remember that we were asked if me and Matt could have made a film with no budget, and if it didn't matter if it was a flop or not, we would have chosen a film to make a film about the BAOR fighting the Third Shock Army in the Rhine. So we're just super excited to be able to get into these two films. And what are the films, Matt?
The films are Soviet Encounter and Fighting in Woods. We've cherry-picked two of the best of the period. Because there's quite a few, isn't there? There's a whole plethora of these British Army training films made in the late 70s, early 80s. You've got films like Demolition Guard, Troop Tactics, Fighting in Villages, which is the companion piece, Sappers in Support, An Unthinking Moment, It Could Be You, and Recce Patrol. Lots of these different things, and they all give this sort of really interesting insights into how individual elements and units within the BAOR, the British Army on the Rhine, would have fought if the Cold War had gone hot in northern Germany. So me and Rob have been excited to do this one because it's one of the first things we actually spoke about when we first started doing the pod, isn't it, Rob?
Yeah.
And we've been thinking, well, it'd be great to do a look at some of these training films, but we need a guest that has a little bit more insight than we do. So we were absolutely overjoyed when we found out about Kenton. We're so pleased to have you on. I mean, should we just jump in with some of these and we can talk about the backgrounds? And
yeah, let's do that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Or did you want to just plug the book quick?
Well, the book is really a description of the limitations that the British Armed Forces were struggling under from sort of 67 onwards, when NATO tried to move away from massive retaliation, the use of every single nuclear weapon it had got in response to any kind of aggression.
Right.
And the idea was to move towards a conventional defence of Western Europe, but nobody was prepared to stump up the cash that needed. And I know we hear a lot about the cost of nuclear weapons, but when you've got half a dozen nuclear weapons that do the job of 500,000 men, there's an obvious payoff. But it was the policy of the time to have high-level conventional forces which were meant to defeat any kind of Soviet attack across the inner German border or into Norway, anything like that. But as I said, that's expensive, very, very expensive. And I think one of the things that is reflected in both of the films is that all we see are mechanized troops. So we are seeing the tip of the spear. We don't get to see the reservists that are coming out in old webbing
like
and
Saxtons and APCs and things, yeah.
Or just all piled into the back of a Bedford 4-tonner.
That's an early Bedford mention, by the way. That's how
I'm sorry.
We absolutely we did all the Bedford on the show. It's great. Love it.
Premature Bedford mention.
Fantastic, though. It's great. No, brilliant.
I mean, I would love to see Fighting on Woods, but with a section from the TA. That would be great, actually.
That'd be brilliant. Yeah, that'd have been something.
Wooden stock SLRs.
Oh, yes.
Piling out of a Saxon. Yeah.
Yeah. A couple of Sterling submachine guns, that kind of thing. A friend of mine was in the TA, and he went on exercise in Germany, and they were charging a Soviet defended hill. And he said it wasn't until he got to the top and the umpire came round and tagged them all with red chalk crosses that he realised that they'd all been killed, and that was it. Their day was finished.
Wow. That sort of puts it into perspective, doesn't it?
It does a bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's something that when you watch these two films, which are both available on YouTube, by the way, you watch them and you think, wow, these lads are very competent, they're very capable, they're well trained, they're well equipped. Both films have no less than 3 different types of anti-tank weapon in them,
Yes.
not counting mines. So they're extremely well equipped. But then the introductions of them always talk about we're defending in depth, and it's always about shoot and scoot, and they're fighting in section ambushes, and they're retiring back and back and back. You have to wonder how long could NATO forces, British NATO forces, keep that up? Because that plays into what I've read that you've written, Kenton, in various articles, etc. And I think it's the crux of your book, isn't it? Where it's the sustainability of, that kind of attritional warfare is not something that the British Army was actually probably going to be capable of.
Well, the whole idea of the sponge tactics, the doctrine of defence in depth, was the profligate use of anti-tank weapons, machine guns, but you had to have them in quantity, massive numbers. And it's all very well having a really expensive anti-tank missile launcher, but if you run out of missiles after the first hour of fighting, well, it's just an expensive piece of metal that you then have to carry around if you want the chance of destroying another tank, on the off chance that you might find some missiles. This is the problem, and not just the Army, but the Air Force, Navy as well, the TA, the Home Defence, you name it. Lots of clever ideas, lots of really good equipment, but almost no backup. The logistics were poor, lack of ammunition, and it wouldn't really matter what the Soviets ended up with. If you didn't have anything to shoot back at them, if they got a T-55, well, they win.
Yeah.
And it's that simple. If the Soviets want to fight an attritional war, they win because we run out of ammunition first. Simple. I hate to be the bearer of bad news.
No, I mean, of course, you can't argue with the facts, can you? So I think, it's a bit of a downer, Matt. They wouldn't win if we did the film.
Well, this is it. That was one of the things that Rob was going to ask. Like, on a man-to-man basis, how would the British soldier fare against, the Soviets? I guess now is a good point to sort of get into these two films, which we've chosen.
Of course.
So a bit of background. They're produced by the British Army's in-house production company, SSVC. They grew up from the SKC, which was the Services Cinema Corporation, which was established during the war, and it evolved through. And then in 1982, it became SSVC, which is now the British Forces Broadcasting Service.
That's it, yeah.
So they were responsible for making these training films, and they worked with independent production companies of various different people. Fighting in Woods was made by RHR Productions. Soviet Encounter was made by Worldwide Pictures Limited, who are still in business, actually. Quite successful, actually. So obviously these were made for soldiers, and they were made to sort of aid training. They show scenarios and make sense of, if you've been in the field training how to dig a slit trench and pad it out with Wrigley tin and sandbag it and all of this, you're like, well, why am I doing this? The film sort of gives you a bit of inclination of why you're doing it. You're putting 2 layers of sandbags on top of your slit trench, so the Soviet artillery doesn't get you. So they're all really important in giving. I think they gave soldiers like an idea of the scenario in which a war could begin, and then what they would be expected to do and what other units will be doing alongside.
Just like that, it's just adding that context, isn't it? It's giving that, making it more personal, I guess. What
it also does, it instructs at the tactical and doctrinal level, and it demonstrates why. And I think you mentioned overhead cover for your slit trench. Why do I have to do that? What's the point? And it's, what's the point? Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do that? Well, this gives you the overview up to sort of company level.
Yeah.
So you can see how if you're just a bog standard Tom sitting in a trench somewhere, you can see how that fits in with what the artillery are doing and what the forward observers are doing, and why they're running around and scuttling between trenches, and why you've got overhead cover, and why the machine gun's sighted there. So it puts everything into perspective for the individual. And it also means the individuals can see how orders work between units and from commander down to individual soldiers. And
absolutely, yeah.
Feedback, then you're getting instructions and information back up the chain. I think it does it really well. It's very clean, almost antiseptic in points, but it gives you that meshing all the way through.
So now I think we should probably talk about what Fighting in Woods and Soviet Encounter actually deal with. So Fighting in Woods is the first one we're going to talk about, because it was filmed in 1982. Basically, how you defend a wood in Germany. It's as simple as that, and it takes you from the inception of the men learning that they're going to be digging in, and the men that are depicted in our 2nd Battalion Grenadier Guards, which is quite good, because I think in Soviet Encounter you don't get any names of regiments.
No, I don't think you do.
No. And it's them from, it says they've got 36 hours to prepare, and it shows the sappers coming in, it shows men setting the defences, the barbed wire, the anti-tank traps, things like that. And then it goes from setting up to doing your ambushes to ultimately making the woods a killing ground in about 19 minutes. That's the synopsis, really. That's the elevator pitch level of detail there.
It brings in this idea of the simple tactical level of how you defend the rides or the fire breaks in the woods, but it describes the difference between the types of woods as well.
Yeah.
And why you adopt a particular style of defense based on what type of wood you're fighting in. Well, if you come from a town or a city, as many of the soldiers would have done, well, they don't know the difference between one type of tree and another, probably. I'm not wishing to denigrate anybody at all, but if you don't know what the different types of woods are going to be, having somebody say there's actually a difference and you have to adapt based on that, that's a really important thing to learn. And naming the fire breaks, giving them really simple names that everybody knows and can understand and recognize.
Yeah, like cat, dog, and such.
Jupiter, Saturn, well, everybody knows what those words are. They're easily distinguishable. And it means that even under extreme stress, at worst, they're going to remember simple instructions. And I think that's what comes across for me anyway in that film.
100%. And I think as well, like on that note, I think it's the narration as well that it's very serious and to the point, but it's also quite personable. Like it uses slang terms like bugging out, things like that. And it goes, when you're making your trenches, or your defenses, don't worry, there are literally piles of wood for you to use.
Yeah.
And there's humour in there as well. Like when one of the FV-432s gets caught out in one of the defences, it gets rocketed by a Soviet trooper, and it goes, you might get more than a parking ticket.
Yeah, bit of dark humour.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, they know their audience, don't they? And soldiers like that kind of humour, and it's the narration in it is one of my favourite aspects of it. It's very business-like, it's very soldierly. They've hit the enemy and they hit him hard. Now they're going to shoot and scoot. It's very clear and it's very reassuring as well. So if you're thinking, if you put yourself into the position of someone who's digging a slit trench in some woods in Germany with Third Shock Army down the road coming at you, you want a little bit of reassurance of in that scenario, we could actually, dig in and hold them off here.
Yeah.
Because it takes a huge war, which would be a global war, and constricts it down into what is a company combat team level, and then it goes down to section level, and it shows 2 section ambushes, and then it's the company defensive position at the very end of the film. And it shows them all going through the motions of what they would do, and everything's going to plan. But it's also quite interesting that they do show that FV432 getting hit by an RPG.
It's the only point in the film where any British troops are implied to be hurt at any point.
Yes, I noticed that too.
The narration's like, and that's an entire section. The company commander's lost an entire section, and now he has to, sort of rejig his defense. The narration throughout is very sort of to the point, and it's similar in a lot of ways to the Soviet encounter narration, but it's a little bit more clipped. It's a bit more straight to it. I think it is tonally.
Because even the ending's quite ominous, and it's all, for me, both movies are trying to say way more without saying it. Obviously, they're trying to be so subtle about how they say it. But at the end, you get this nice little montage of troops in their little slit trenches firing at their SLRs at oncoming Soviet troops, and it's every beat is like never. You see a shot of a guy shooting an SLR. Never gets out. Make sure the enemy never get out alive.
Yeah.
Well, that's saying way more to me, at least, because it's like, you have to hold them. You can do nothing but hold them here, because if you don't, all the men behind you are fucked. They know that the guys know that, I guess. In the National Army Museum I visited a few weeks ago, you see on the wall, they've got a quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but if the Russians cross the border, then we've got 36 hours to live. And it's like, well, if a veteran is saying that at the time, like I think it was from the 70s, then the guys must have known that if the Russians cross the border, it's pretty touch and go. The bleakness isn't lost, I guess.
The lack of an end, a firm end of both films shows that, yes, things are touch and go, but the whole idea of defense in depth, that you don't retreat, that you're redeploying, you're pulling back to other prepared positions, that this is reinforced throughout both films. And I think it is meant to reassure those soldiers who have been told you've got 36 hours to live if they do come over the border, and say, well, okay, some of you are going to die. That will happen. That's what happens in war. It's sad, but it's true. The rest of you, however, you redeploy back and somebody comes, takes over the line, however it works. There's an attempt at realism in the fact that you see an FV432 get hit and nobody gets out. But there's also that attempt at reassurance, some of you will survive, the battle will go on. It's more the psychological part of both of the films that doesn't have anything to do with tactics or doctrine or anything like that. It's speaking directly to the soldiers.
100% there. Yeah.
What strikes me about the film is they show the soldiers as being extremely capable and competent, where you have a section commander radioing a situation report, and he says, out of 35 Soviets that dismounted and infiltrated through the woods, he returns to his fixed positions, and he reports back that he's killed about 30 of them and knocked out 2 ACPs, which I'm sure they would have been more than capable of doing. But it does strike you as that they are hoping to make a dent well above what they are hoping to, take back in return, so to speak.
Well, I mean, it's a propaganda piece as well, isn't it?
Well, it is. Exactly. It's you have to remember, again, it's made for the soldier, isn't it? And you can't see them taking massive casualties, and that's not going to help morale.
No, of course
but
not.
One of the things that it made me think about was, it talks about they have 36 hours to dig in the beginning, and the fact that they're causing so many casualties is, from what you've researched, Kenton, do you think that is accurate? Do you think that that's based in sort of statistical analysis they've done, or is it just an optimistic?
I think the style that they've adopted is massively optimistic for the 70s and 80s, simply because they're portraying the Soviets as being a very passive enemy. Yeah, they talk about air attack and they talk about artillery and tanks and stuff like that. Let's be honest, the Soviets wouldn't pussyfoot around if they came up against a bit of a hard spot. They'd just stick a motor rifle regiment or a tank regiment in. So it's not going to be 9 T-55s or whatever it is they're using, but it's going to be 70, 80 odd T-72s or T-80s supported by half a dozen helicopters with an airstrike and probably divisional, maybe even front artillery support.
Massive.
So not only are you going to be saturated by enormous amounts of high explosive, while that's happening, they're going to be driving upwards of 100 tanks and God knows how many armoured personnel carriers at you.
Yeah.
The steamroller effect, then you do get the position where you're defeated in place and the front line is punched through. They've got the break-in battle sorted. Then you start thinking up a higher level that the operational manoeuvre groups and the front attacks then rupture the NATO front line and basically it's all over. Cheery thought.
Well, that's it. I mean, I thought Peter Watkins' The War Game, where the war sort of goes nuclear and you get a brief shot of some, I think it's NATO forces. I think it's either American or British. And he really captures the sort of the chaos of being bombarded by, massed Soviet artillery. They're crouched in a trench and it's just the camera's shaking. And he obviously he's captured it really well because it's such a tight shot. But I think they don't really get that across in either of these two films. They have some hints at Soviet artillery and what it's going to be capable of. It could probably level that woods that they're in. When you think about it, but it's very compartmentalized in that it's just showing like this one small. It's almost like it's just taking into account that they'll stop like the initial vanguard, but when a company or battalion sized force comes up, there's very little chance of them stopping that with a like a company sized combat team.
I think that's what the film is meant to reinforce for the individual soldiers. I'm sure it's not meant to reflect what senior officers would expect to happen in the war, because that would be a really short film and would be really unpleasant for the troops watching it. If you look at the weight of Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front in the Second World War, they learned really quickly that if you're going to punch a hole through the enemy, you just saturate their front line with artillery.
Yeah.
And it works.
I guess it boils down to perhaps, they're making these movies and they've got to show with the best intentions what they have and how they're going to use it. I guess it's sort of show your best bet in an ideal world, what you could do.
Yes.
Just because you have to.
It's not meant as instruction for how the British Army will fight the Soviets. This is meant to show the soldiers how you fight in a wood. And I know that sounds obvious.
Yeah.
And it is to some extent, but that's what it is for. So you're seeing the very low level tactics, because when I go back to my earlier point that when the fan has really been hit properly and it's flying around, you want really simple instructions, and you want to know that when you turn around and run, that the armored personnel carrier is going to be there with the door open, and that wild horses will have to intervene to stop you from getting in it.
Yeah, I mean the bench in the FV432 would be the comfiest chair in the world if I just didn't come out with a T-72. So I think this brings us perfectly into Soviet Encounter, because where Fighting in Woods might be about the tactical level, Soviet Encounter is a different beast entirely. So Matt, would you like to give us a quick run through of Soviet Encounter?
Yeah, Soviet Encounter is an interesting one because it's slightly later.
83.
Yeah, 83. So it begins with sort of a sort of like tactical overview, doesn't it?
Do you want the narration? Do you want the quote?
Go for it.
For many years, tension has existed in Europe between the forces of NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
With all of these films, it sort of just goes, oh, well, we're at war with the Soviets now, and this is what's going to happen.
It's something like, let's assume, for political reasons, that an attack from the Eastern Bloc has happened. That's as much as you get, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And then we get a tactical overview where it explains the Soviet unit that is going to attack them and their sort of like force structure. And then it's again the defensive element of the plan, and it's sort of them preparing their positions, and it's kind of like a slightly broader look at an initial defense than fighting in woods, because fighting in woods gives you a look at sort of section up to platoon, a little bit of company, whereas I think Soviet Encounter tries to talk about other arms as well. So, you know, there's mention of artillery and that sort of thing.
Doesn't it? It starts off quite broad, and then it goes, you know, for the purposes of the movie, we're going to view this battle from a British company group.
Yeah.
It narrows itself down again to make it more personable, like fighting in woods does. But Soviet Encounter feels, I mean, me and Kenton were talking about this before we started recording, but this feels like a culmination of, I'll pick some names out, you know, the demo guards, sappers in support, effects of artillery fire, of fighting patrol. It seems like it's elements from all of those movies finally put into one more narrative piece of this is how we stop them. Because this movie is this is how we stop them. This is the definite, for me, it's a definite takeaway of Soviet Encounter. It's like, it might be the encounter, but this is going to be the index as well.
The Soviets will only accept the loss of momentum when you force it on them, is the narrator's line, isn't it? And that is basically what it is. It's how you slow them, get them to debus, and you know, on a man-to-man basis, what you're going to do at the end of it. But I think, as you say there, it sort of takes little bits from a lot of those other training films, and if you put in parts from those other training films, you would get like a sort of like bumper version of Soviet Encounter, where
I think you'd
have a lot more, you know, context and various different bits. So you know, with Wreck-It Patrol, you'd have your preliminary of finding out where they are, and then with troop platoon tactics, you'd see how they would fall back through defensive positions and stuff.
It's as if the army, the SSVC films, training films at least, are shot on some sort of fictional broad front. Sappers in support takes place over here, Soviet Encounters over here, fighting in woods is over here. This is your sort of front line. That kind of narrative sense, that makes sense.
It does. I struggled more with this film than I did the fighting in woods, but for a couple of reasons. It's it's aimed very much at the individual soldier, because it starts off with this thing about what the Soviets will try to do to you. And I was kind of expecting him then to say, and what you're going to do to the Soviets, but I don't think he used quite those words.
They say, like, learn the lessons today, tomorrow could be too late.
Yeah, this is becoming very, very much about the individual. That's reinforced towards the end, where it's all about you're trained better, you're equipped better than the Soviets, they're just conscripts. So there's this contrast, but the whole bit about what the Soviets will do to you just reminded me of the quote, I think it was from Lenin, that war, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. It had, maybe that's too much of an academic viewpoint, but it had that echo to it. Rightly jingoistic about, you're brilliantly trained, you've got the best weapons we can give you, you will obviously win. But this then leads into the second problem that I have with it, which is that this is based on a sudden attack, something like 48 hours or 36 hours or something, I can't remember exactly now, which is the worst scenario that NATO can think up. In all its exercises, it gives itself 3 weeks to mobilize.
Right.
Well, if the Soviets attack in 24, 48 hours, you have no mobilization of the reserves. You have no logistical support for the troops that are already in Germany. All the war maintenance reserves, the ammunition, the kit, the transport, the spares, it's all still locked up in warehouses that are probably being bombed as you go to unlock them. As far as the British Army goes, that's it. It's all over. You don't have to think beyond the 48 hours. That's your lot. It's done. Whilst they're trying to put a really brave face on it, they've picked the worst scenario to choose from. And perhaps that's because I know too much about it. If you're an infantryman, you don't have any of that knowledge.
No, that's
as far
true.
as you're concerned, you have got the best equipment and the best training, and there will be tens or hundreds of thousands of other troops to help you out, when in fact none of that is going to happen.
To be devil's advocate, I think it's his greatest strength because it can just completely balls to the wall, just show you how well the British Army are going to react. And this is fantastic.
66 mil laws and a GPMG, you're going to be absolutely fine.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you were a reservist and you saw this, it would make you feel better as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it made me feel proud and all of that. And I was, sitting in my living room watching it on my big TV. So I couldn't be any further from the reality of war. And at the end of it, where he's saying, you've got the best training and you're up against conscripts. Yeah, go, that's boys.
Because whenever it can, it takes a little slight at the Soviet army. Whenever it can, it's like, it's just all he knows. He's been in the army 2 years, maybe more, but he doesn't know anything more than that. You are far better trained, and it doesn't, it might not mention that you're down the naffy the night before, pissed out your mind.
Yeah, you can save Western civilization with a 7.62 rifle and a cup of tea.
It's that sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, we should probably mention the actor Edward Judd was the narrator for Soviet Encounter, and he was probably best well known from his role in The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which is another Cold War movie. So that's quite a nice connection.
Oh, I thought I recognised his voice.
Yeah, and he did a lot of Think road safety adverts. He's quite a prominent voice actor in his day too. So that finally puts a voice to a name to the voice, which is quite nice.
I wish we knew who the narrator for Fighting in Woods was, because I tried to find out, and obviously
he pops up in a couple of others.
He does. He's Demolition Guard.
That's it. Yeah,
and in a few others, and he has that quite noticeable clipped, very on point style where he's just very it's like he's sat next to you telling you we're going to get these Soviets, don't worry.
Well, if anyone knows, please let us know.
I mean, one thing we can mention just before we move on from Soviet Encounter is production wise, I think it's really interesting that they incorporate a lot of stock footage, which is really interesting, which they do a little bit of that in Fighting in Woods, but with Soviet Encounter, it's much more, look at this artillery. And then it's a slightly dated by that point, 60s, 70s clip of some I'm not a Soviet artillery expert, but it's field artillery, and then some clips of MiGs going over and that sort of thing.
And
it's those little, you get a little bit of an inclination of, Jesus, the Soviets have a lot of stuff, which you don't really get with some of the others, where it's just it's fine. It's just going to be one APC coming up a
narrow road.
The production value on both of them actually is really impressive. It would
have been interesting to find a budget.
It feels very high, and probably the budget wasn't that big. God knows. I mean, with it being the MOD, I can't imagine it being big money. But there's some pyrotechnics have gone into this, most definitely. And we've got with Fighting in Woods, we're lucky enough to know some of the production crew, because it gives it in the credits at the end. And the director is Rene Basilico, who did stuff throughout the 50s through to the 90s, I think. He did a lot of public service videos and training videos, and he did The Hole in the Ground, which you might have seen, which is the 1962 public service movie about the Royal Observer Corps. And it's the doctor goes into the bunker and he's like, oh, this is all very impressive. And then the box on the wall goes off and all hell breaks loose, and it's World War III. And that's a really well-made film. So he worked on that one, I believe.
Cracking film, that.
Production-wise, I think they definitely punch above their weight, which is hopefully what the British Army on the Rhine would have done.
And I think that's, as well, before we go on to Ali Tally, I think that's why they hold up so well. is because they
Absolutely.
look really good. You know, if there's war films at the time who I bet have like triple the budget, maybe 10 times the budget of these movies.
Well, they haven't got anyone
worse.
somersaulting.
No, they don't have any
No
of
somersaults
that.
in them.
Yeah.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
And they don't
Brilliant
have like an
acting
aging
from the Soviet soldiers.
Yeah, they don't have like an aging Cliff
the
Robertson.
acting, when you
Yeah.
Oh, you hate Cliff Robertson so much.
I don't
But
like
the thing is, when you look at all these guys, they're obviously the entire cast is serving soldiers, but they all do it fairly well. Like there's the young subaltern who commands the platoon. It's as awkward as you would feel an O group briefing would be, with a Rupert just chatting to these lads, and they're all like, "Yes, sir."
He stutters his lines, doesn't he, as well? He can't remember
He does a little bit, yeah.
Going where. But I think that adds to the charmingness of the movie.
Well, it feels realistic, and it's not sort of like they're not looking at the camera and going, "And now we're going to attack on this position," which is sort of something you sometimes see in some World War II training films.
Yeah,
they've given them the right direction to get like a fairly authentic performance, I thought.
I think the different troops revert to type, though, because the engineers get to blow stuff up. You leave an engineer in a field for 5 minutes and they blow something to pieces.
He does take down that very thin tree, doesn't he? That tree is very thin. I don't think that tree needed a fell in charge on it. I think you could have done that with an axe.
Explosive did it take? Yeah.
Please, Sarge, please let me use a fell in charge, please.
But the other thing I noticed was I don't know whether they were stock issue, but there was some fantastic moustaches.
Oh, they were great, weren't they?
Yeah. Thank God they weren't wearing the full NBC suits. We wouldn't have seen them. Well, that does take us into the alley tally, doesn't it?
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So, as every week, we love to delve into the kit and the weapons, and this week it's absolutely chock full again. Kenton, is there anything you'd like to point out first as our guest? You get the first pick.
Again, there's two things, if I might be so bold.
Of course.
One was the FV432 with the peak turret.
Yeah.
Which I was really pleased but surprised to see as well. I know there were plans to have them 2 in every platoon or something like that. That they were going to put turrets on the 432s, but I think it ended up them just going over to the Berlin Brigade.
Yeah, the Fox armored car or scimitar turrets, I think, aren't they, or something similar?
Yeah. And the other thing was that all of the Soviet troops were in BTR 60s and had to get out the top, and they kept going on about that. But there was only one BMP-1 in both films. I was really disappointed about that. I don't suppose there were enough captured BMP-1s left over from the Yom Kippur War for them to be able to ship 50 of them over and do a full regimental attack. But yeah, those are the two standouts for me. Lots of other sort of anti-tank weapons and bits and pieces. But the peak and the BTR 60.
Yeah, nice, aren't they?
It's impressive. Obviously, the stock footage again of T-55s. No, it's T-72s in there, isn't it? In Soviet encounter by the 80s, T-55 would have been second line, wouldn't it, by that point? But yeah, they use chieftains, and I love how they've taken bits off of the chieftains.
Yeah, fighting in woods, the grey chieftains. Yeah.
They've painted a little red star on the turret of the chieftain, and taken off some of the thermal skirting, and
gives it away because they got 50 cows on the turrets.
Well, because I was looking at that and I was like, Rob, what is that? Is that a chieftain? Because it just didn't look right, and I was like, well, it's mantleless, so it must be. I just really like that they've taken off the smoke grenade discharges and the side skirts just to make them look a little bit different.
See, I think it's differently because I think some poor RTR chap just got given a big barrel of grey paint. It was like, right, lads, you've got to paint up these chieftains today. Some poor fella just grey washing a chieftain.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was the definition on the video, but the red star isn't very neat.
It's not, is it? No.
On the turret, is it? When it goes past, it's like, oh.
Yeah.
But yeah, the vehicle stuff in this is great. they might only have, one BMP and some BTR 60s, like 2 max, I think you see in the whole thing. But yeah, they do like mentioning that they're having to get out the top of the BTRs.
Yeah.
And that's when they're at their most vulnerable. It is a design flaw, obviously.
Yeah.
But,
Bit of a drawback. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's that bit in Fighting in Woods where they do get out of the BMP and they get absolutely mullered by GPMG, don't they, as they get out?
That's what you get for reversing into an ambush. Why is the BMP's door facing that way? He goes over a mine, I know that much.
That's the beauty of the pit that they've dug for the GPMG. So
yeah, it's true.
Perfect positioning.
Exactly. But in Soviet Encounter, not as many troops get mullered as they should, because in Soviet Encounter, those men are clearly within killing range of that GPMG and all those men in the pits, and they still are allowed to run on. And I'm like,
well, this
hang on.
This is it, isn't it? Like with Soviet Encounter, they're defending a bit of a minefield, and it's more open field than Fighting in Woods is.
Yeah.
And it talks about how
yet the kill count is less.
Yeah. And it talks about how Soviet tanks will come forward with flails. They'll knock out some of the mines, and then APCs will get as close as they can, and then they'll have to dismount. But the minefield will keep the APCs at arm's length,
at distance.
And the plucky Soviet conscript will have to charge through the minefield on his own.
It's all best case scenario, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
Even when they're bunched up going through the barbed wire, which I would have thought would have been perfect for the GPMG, only a couple of them fall over.
In reality, you would have had a GPMG on a sustained fire mount, and they would have had that zeroed, and the beaten ground would have been they would have been able to dial in the beaten zone wherever they made the hole in the wire. Way too many of those Soviets got through that hole in the wire, I think.
Just a bit.
But you needed that so that Soviet at the end could run up charging with his bayonet.
Yeah.
And the narrator could be like, on a man-to-man basis, you need to find out how well you can kill Soviet troops.
Did anyone else notice in Soviet Encounter, the lads in that little like ruined house that are sitting on the GPMG with a tripod, they look so bloody bored. I couldn't believe it.
I thought one of them was falling asleep.
Yeah, exactly.
At one point.
Yeah. Oh, what's that, mate? Oh, you better give him another burst.
A stay 6 hours of terror and waiting, and then 20 minutes of emptying all 4 of your GPMG belts, and then you're dead.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's got to be the amount of Law 80s that we see get fired, and that is just looks great. Absolutely love it. Every single shot is a kill shot.
Yes, no one misses in this film.
There's no glancing blows. What gets me more is that I don't know if any of you have seen the Bricksmiths documentary on the BS YouTube channel, but there's a whole thing where the guy goes, "Oh, I was rooting around here because this is where the Soviets used to test their armor, and I came across like a block of armor off of a Matt will know what it is. You know those little like square bits of armor they put on the turrets.
Oh yeah,
the reactive stuff.
Reactive stuff. Yeah, exactly. But in both movies, that's never mentioned at all. So
no.
It's quite interesting when you think about it. Is that before they know how that works, or is that before they know they can counter it? It's quite an interesting thought. I don't know if it's,
Yeah, I mean, by 82, 83, I think reactive armor was a year or 2 away at that point.
Yeah.
Right.
Obviously.
But I think we come back to this business about the soldiers being given the best weapons. Well, of course it knocks out Russian tanks every time you pull the trigger. Bound to.
I mean, obviously they're overview videos, and they don't talk about the capabilities of the individual weapons because they're covered in other videos, and they're covered in training exercises and actual training. But yeah, they don't really consider the fact that Law 80s and 66 mil laws have sort of limited range. It's 100 to 400 yards. With both of those, really, isn't it? But this is why they made Fighting in Woods and Fighting in Villages, because it's their environments that they think are the most likely to slow down armored vehicles, etc. Because they historically they don't cope well in that kind of terrain. So it makes sense that they made Fighting in Woods and Fighting in Villages as specific videos to talk about those two environments.
And I think it reflects the environment across North Germany. That you've got villages every, something like 1 or 1.5 kilometers, and vast areas of woodland. So you make the best of that. And the best of that is you
Absolutely
soak up the attack, you slow them down, and you do that with prodigious numbers of anti-tank weapons and artillery and mines. Mines, importantly, I don't think get enough coverage in either of the two. I know there are mines mentioned, and one bar mine is shown. But
they're shown as being sort of very localized in that they're funneling troops. They aren't area denial.
Yeah,
sort of they are the weapon that will stop them initially. They would have had to have seeded miles and miles of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines on the northern plains to actually deny that big open space.
But that's where the development of the artillery delivered bomblets, it was recognized as being a problem. And the bar mine as well, when you stick that on the back of an FV432, the bar mine layer, it's just like a little plow, and it lays them automatically. So you could put a fair number of mines down in a relatively short period of time.
Do we see the bar mine FV432?
No, but there's a bar mine shown.
It is in what is the other one it's in? It's in Demo Guard, and they do a lot of sort of showing of the mines in that one, don't they? They even show firing out the anti-personnel mines as well off one of those little launchers.
Yeah, because they tried putting the launchers for the bomblets in the back of Stalwarts as well.
Right.
Drive those up to the edge of the battlefield and just fire them off.
Right.
So it was certainly recognised as being a problem. How you mine a field in the face of a Soviet advance because you know that they're going to be moving quickly. While the films are showing almost a ponderous approach of the reconnaissance units of the enemy, the actual tactics and doctrine realised that they're going to be moving much faster than that, and you need something that drops hundreds of mines in their way really quickly. Yeah. So there's a bit of a clash there, I think.
I did like seeing the few guys in NBC suits. Even in both films, there's no mention of nukes at all, which I think is quite interesting in itself.
Or chemical weapons of any type.
Exactly. But it's just nice to see. And I like 68 pattern DPM, so that's always nice to see, isn't it?
It does look good.
It's fantastic. I couldn't work out, are some chaps in ankle parties or not? Or is that more of a 70s thing?
I think so, yeah. Some of them,
sure.
I swear to God, I saw some clasps on some of them.
Yeah.
I didn't even take any notice of that.
Well, this is the kind of thing that Rob looks for. He loves that kind of thing.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
I've watched that, in preparation for this, I've watched that many British Army Cold War training films. They all kind of meld into one. And I'm like, have I seen that in this film or have I seen that in another film?
You kind of get to know the era, don't you? Because it's like if you've seen a 60s, 70s, they're in that olive like combat smock thing. And then then DPM, at least you can sort of narrow it down.
Yeah. If we talk about the uniforms for a minute, it's such a good look.
It's a strong look, isn't it?
It is. You can pinpoint it immediately, like you say. For me, it has to be that we get Milan, Law 80, and the 66mm laws as well. The ranges they're showing, especially in Fighting in Woods, are more than believable.
Yes.
And I like the way that they talk about where to place the Milan launcher, which is a wide guided rather than just rocket anti-tank missile. They talk about placing that at the back of the woods to sort of cover the possibility of the Soviets slipping around the edges of the woods, etc. Yes. But alongside those anti-tank weapons, we get a copious amount of GPMG, which is just the star of the film, isn't it, really? That is the weapon that we see the most. We see SLRs going, but it's that constant sort of bursts of GPMG fire that sort of characterize the battle scenes within both of these films.
They like punctuate moments, don't they?
They do, yeah. So the narration is around those bursts in a lot of instances, and that's an interesting sort of like stylistic choice, perhaps, or maybe it's just we can't possibly talk over the GPMG, But yeah, I find these films really fascinating because they give us a look at the best scenario kit that an infantry unit would have had at the period.
I was going to talk briefly about that, at risk of plugging my book again. I'm looking at one of the illustrations for it from an exercise in 1979, and the guy is a territorial radio operator, and he's wearing an NBC smock and olive trousers, a 44 pattern helmet, and a 9mm L2 A3 Sterling.
Very nice.
And he's got a Larkspur
Beautiful
radio. So a real mashup of kit. This goes back to what we were all saying earlier about these soldiers. They're the mechanized tip of the spear, but they make up a tiny percentage of the 110,000 soldiers that would have been in place on mobilization. The rest of them would have been in 44 pattern helmets and 58 pattern webbing, and we're seeing the perfect group almost in the films.
Definitely.
That perfect look, that perfect feel, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it's the ideal of what they should have had, because they bug out and they take like 3 lords with them that they haven't used. And would you have had that amount of kit on you? I don't know. It's what would you have been issued at that short notice?
They might have had that amount of weaponry on the first or second day, but after that, that's your lot.
Yeah.
In the real world, that and that's the bit that I kind of focus on. So it's all very well having these great weapons, but you have to have them in huge numbers. You've got to be profligate with them, and that costs a lot of money.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of Sterlings, I was quite disappointed we don't get to see any in action.
No, you don't, do you?
No, you don't at all. You see, there's a radio operator with one who's in the O group meeting. He's just sat listening to the plan, and
doesn't one of the NCOs have one?
Yeah, I think so. There's a sergeant with one as well,
yeah,
isn't
he
there?
does, yeah.
Which is a bit weird, actually, because you would think he would have probably had an SLR. Because by the 80s, like everyone's like
quality kit when he sees it, man.
He's nicked that. He's had that away.
Yeah,
or somebody else gets it.
yeah.
But yeah, so I was a little bit disappointed there was no one was having it large with the Sterling, but that
maybe in Fighting in Villages, Matt, if we ever get to see that.
Maybe I'm hoping. I have it on order from the Imperial War Museum, so I'm hoping that's where the Sterling comes into its own. But yeah, I mean, the only thing we haven't really mentioned is the weapons that the guys in Soviet Encounter have, and the actual Soviets themselves, and we get to see them quite clearly. And there's quite a plethora in there. There's RPG-7s, which obviously we don't see it, but in Fighting in Woods, that's what takes out the APC.
In Fighting in Woods, I actually think he's using a law.
Oh, is he really?
Really?
I looked at it blown up, and he clearly's not got the huge RPG. So I think they're just using what they've got. But it's interesting little tidbit anyway.
But yeah, they've got an interesting mix of RPK like machine guns, and the AKs. Some of them are Romanian. They're MD63s, which have that characteristic wooden front grip at the front.
Oh wow!
And that's why when he's running at the end of the film towards the camera, you can see he's holding onto the front grip, which there's only a couple of AKs at that period that would have had them. But yeah, the uniforms are interesting. I don't know whether they were a little bit dated by the time this is being made, so they're quite sort of plain khaki. They strike me as being more 60s, 70s era.
It's not out of place. I know that seeing some footage of Soviet troops in Afghanistan, they've got that SAM type fatigue. Some of the guys look like they're wearing overalls as well.
Yeah,
so maybe
there's sort of like tankers stuff in there, isn't there? It's kind of hinting at being tankers. There's a couple of guys in Fighting in Woods who I think they're all wearing overalls when they climb out the top of that BTR. And one of them sort of like slumps over when he gets shot as he's trying to debus at the top of the vehicle.
Yeah. Someone got that classic brown, like World War II type jacket and Jodhpur style trousers, haven't they?
Yeah, Soviet Encounter has one PKM. This is the question, like some of the kit they would have obviously had in training units and stuff. Some of the stuff was definitely in the British Army's School of Infantry collection, because there's in 79 there's a good, I think it's 79. There's a good Warsaw Pact small arms and light weapons video made, which is also on YouTube.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Where they talk through lots of the different weapons and show them firing it, etc. So like a familiarization video. I looked in vain to try and work out where they would have, gotten some of the uniforms and stuff, but I'm wondering whether it was stuff they had for op force training units, that sort of thing, that was pressed into use, or perhaps something the production company managed to get their hands on uniform wise. But it does get across the feel of Soviet troops. It feels authentic. It doesn't feel like they've just mocked up some guys and given whatever they could, scrounge together. It feels quite authentic.
I think it gives a good impression when they're breaking through the barbed wire of dozens and dozens of these soldiers coming at you, and when you see it from within the GPMG bunker, and they're shooting directly at them, and you begin to get that sense of what happens when the steamroller gets really, really close. There may only be half a dozen of them, but they're half a dozen angry people with guns. So
the Soviet conscript only knows how to go forward.
Well, of course, yes,
as the narration says.
Don't underestimate him.
No, never.
With your superior training and skills, what you must know is how to stop him.
That's it. At some point in this episode, we are going to read out the full Soviet encounter narration. But is there anything else that you guys thought was interesting for the Ali tie?
No, I don't really know.
I really appreciated seeing the anti-tank weapons, although they were probably a little bit optimistic in how accurate and their kill ratio, so to speak, was. But I thought it was really interesting that they managed to show all of these different elements of what the infantry platoon was equipped with. In some of the other training films, they have Carl Gustavs, but obviously with this being 83, 82, 84, they're showing what is going to be more used down the line. No SA-80s as yet, because we don't see those in training films until I think about 85, 86.
No. But it is the perfect image.
Yeah.
They're all in, they're all mechanized. They've all got kit. All the kit works. It is a perfect scenario. And that's what you would expect for a training film. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the only failing in the whole sort of the two films is that FB432 that gets stuck on the log and knocked out, and that is shown as being it's very much Soviet artillery has knocked this tree down, and your escape route that you'd pre-planned has been blocked. And it's a very much sort of like a teaching moment in which they're saying you should be able to adapt and you should have multiple routes that you will go by, and don't panic. It's all very much in that training sort of mindset of we need to instill a little bit of free thought into the escape routes, etc., and tactical movement.
It's the flexibility, isn't it, what they're trying to get across to the soldiers is you may want to have your armored personnel carrier right next to you because that's safe, but it's not a good idea.
It's too close.
So you get in this idea of to be safer, you actually have to make yourself a little bit more vulnerable in the short term. But then again, I still reckon the driver, if he'd have gunned that, had have got away.
Yeah, he didn't try very hard.
I thought that. He was very gingerly trying to get over it.
The narration over that point is quite good. It's the parking ticket line that Rob mentioned. He says, that's why APC shouldn't park too close to the ambush position. You could end up with more than a parking ticket.
At that moment, the RPG rocket hits, and they linger on the shot just a little bit for you to think, oh shit, there are lads in there. And I thought, and that's quite admirable because they don't do it in Soviet encounter. And I think maybe they could have shown a couple of lads being hit just to maybe ramp the tension a little bit more, perhaps.
Well, but I think that would detract from the whole idea that the better trained, better equipped soldiers win. But
of course,
I did notice that after the APC gets hit, after the FV432 gets hit, they cut to another shot immediately afterwards, and the FV 432 that has survived almost does a handbrake turn as it comes to a halt.
Yes.
So you get that sense of urgency that actually we're moving quite quickly.
Mm.
So I think that probably brings us on to final thoughts. But I was going to ask Kenton a question to lead us in. Do you think, from your research, obviously from writing your book, we're very excited to read. Do you think these films accurately show the strengths and the weaknesses of the BAOR at that time?
I think they portray the perfect unit. They portray what the army wanted to be and hoped to be, but this kit is fantastically expensive, so you can only give it to a few picked units, and only the units that you think are going to be on the receiving end of the worst the enemy has. So I think it's very optimistic, naturally, because it's a training film, but it is incredibly optimistic in terms of how the kit is distributed, how the troops are equipped. It doesn't reflect the reality, I don't think, and I'm happy to be proved wrong, but I don't think it reflects the reality of the vast majority of troops that were stationed in Germany, because things changed so often. You went from field force back to divisions, and they were trying out different ways of equipping the armoured personnel carriers with this, that, and the other, and there was no real stability. And add that to the constant cuts in the defence budget, and what you end up with are a bunch of troops, soldiers, sailors, aircrew, doing their best with very much a can-do attitude, but without the kit that they need to do their job. So very optimistic, I think, is the best way of describing it. Optimistic in the best possible way, but gives the wrong impression.
You can very much see from the fact that their purposes as training films why they've done that.
Yes, absolutely,
and
that's why I'm choosing my words very carefully. This doesn't detract either from the personnel that were involved, or
definitely,
the drivers and the soldiers, whatever. They were doing what they thought was the right thing. They just weren't equipped properly. And if there's a finger to point, it gets pointed at Westminster or the MOD, both probably, for failing to provide them with what they needed.
The only film I can think of that does show sort of failings is Demolition Guard, where it shows the bridge being sabotaged, and certain aspects of that where they face sort of small factors that they don't expect, sort of thing, and then but at the end of that, the outcome is still, it's a positive. The bridge gets destroyed, it's mission successful, but as you say, it's not the frontline troops that are being portrayed in these films. It's the stockpiles, the logistics, the funding that goes into maintaining these stockpiles, which would feed these delayed actions.
But I think if you look at any non-military viewpoint, the narratives, for example, from General Hackett's book, Third World War, the only way the West wins is because the Eastern forces dissolve and the British provide an extra army corps, but the battle goes on for, 2 weeks. Well, the army was utterly incapable of doing that. 2 days maybe, but 2 weeks never. So there's this narrative there that we'll all be fine because we can fight our way through, but actually we can't because we don't have anything to fight with.
Absolutely fascinating.
That's it, I think, isn't it? That's the crux of it.
Yeah.
But then to sort of bring us back to sort of the film aspect of it. I mean, I'm not a military man from my background at all. I come from I trained to be an actor at university and stuff, but from a narrative point of view, from a viewpoint, from a viewer, these movies are just they're fantastic little insights into, not only, how warfare was fought back then, but sort of how an army works. Yes. So, if you're not, if you're a dear listener, if you're not versed in how you defend a wood, if you're not versed in how an army prepares its soldiers to fight with its own media, then these movies are fantastic. And if you have any passing interest in the 80s and the Cold War, all these British Army training films, even the American ones, there are a few Soviet ones floating around. They're just a fantastic little glimpse into a war that never happened. For me, that's why I enjoy them so much. It's that whole what if aspect of it. And these movies are the only few pieces of media that give you that little glimpse in. I know there's Chieftains that was written by an ex-tank commander. There's obviously Hackett's Third World War. But there aren't many proper narrative movies that deal with it. And if they do deal with it, it's tacked on to a nuclear warfare.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the missing Cold War what if movie, but they're all just hidden in SSVC films.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that the training films do what they're meant to do. But for us looking back at it, with a certain amount of nostalgia, I mean, I play war games. I've done Cold War games. You can take the information that you learn from these videos and apply it directly to the war games table. And very often it works, and it works just how they tell you it will do. So long as you're not playing someone who's also watched the films, you're okay.
Yeah. So basically, if you're in a war game and you're facing off against a BAOR detachment, just buy as many tanks as you can and you're going to win.
Yeah, either that or artillery and just plaster the place. Yeah.
Pound the place. Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Yeah. When you're watching these films, you have to suspend a little bit of logical thought, don't you? When you think about it from the Soviet perspective, you would layer in some artillery support. You would be pushing a lot more troops into those areas. And to be fair to the films, they do say that, once that vanguard and the leading companies sort of halted, they probably would push the full battalion straight into the wood. But this is where the films end, and what your research shows, they don't show that. They don't show the fact that after that initial attack, there's going to be battalion-sized, regimental, brigade-sized elements pushing into these stop areas, and they're going to steamroll through because they aren't showing, the films aren't showing these company-sized combat teams just being completely overwhelmed by A, numbers, and B, they're going to run out of ammunition eventually because yes, they're in woodland or they're in a village, that's great, but how are the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, Royal Logistics Corps going to resupply these men when Soviet air power and artillery are doing route denial, that kind of thing?
Brave men in Bedford M4s coming up.
Yeah, some plucky lads in number 3 helmets and
those
Bedfords
brave boys in their beddies full of Milan rounds coming to save you.
Don't worry, we've got plenty more Law 80s on the back of this. Wonder how many Law 80s you can fit onto the back of a Bedford.
Oh, that'd be a fun.
We've worked that one out.
Yeah. Quick, lads, before the Heinz spot us. It's like. So I think on that note, that might bring us to the end of this one, Matt. What do you think?
It's been really fascinating to look at them as films, but also appreciate the context they were made in and the audience they were made for.
Yeah,
they do give us real interesting insight into sort of the tactics that they would have implemented and the capabilities that the British Army had in the early 80s. So they're really cool. They're just aesthetically really cool and
great films,
fun to watch. They're just, obviously it's a niche audience, but I just find them really fascinating to sort of watch a couple of them and see how they fit in with one another and what they have to say about how things would have been approached, in a defensive posture. They're just really interesting little pieces of sort of primary history in their own right.
Maybe me and Matt we're going to probably be maybe the only two people that I say this about, but they become really addictive because you want to know, not only you want to know, okay, they defended a wood. How are they going to defend a street? How are they going to defend a city? You get really sort of into it because of, for me at least, as I mentioned earlier, it's that what if thing.
Yes.
And it just becomes so interesting, And just for me, like learning how the British Army change and how the kit changes, but just how tactics work and things like that. There's so much to pick out and enjoy from these movies.
Well, I'm with you. They've become massively addictive. And every time I turn a new one up off YouTube, that's it. That's me for half an hour. I'll maybe watch it 2 or 3 times. So
same as me.
It's terrible. I lose afternoons.
I can go, is that 68 pattern, Rob? Is that, oh, look, he's got a GPMG. Look, you know, it's just
ankle putties at 2 minutes 31. You know, it's sort of like that.
Ken, you mentioned the 432 with the turret on. I was like, Rob, that's turreted. I hadn't noticed that before, and I only noticed that when I watched it back yesterday in preparation for this. It's the joy of really sort of picking them apart and being a bit anarchy about it, isn't it? I suppose.
But it's also a good reason to watch them over and over again because you can see new things each time. And well, that's my excuse. That's what I tell the wife anyway.
Feeding into that sort of addiction, we found out that there is a companion film to this called Fighting in Villages, which isn't available anywhere online because luckily some of them a lot of them are now on YouTube. But if you go through the Imperial War Museum sort of like catalogue of what was made by the SKC and the SVC, there are literally pages and pages and pages of these films that haven't been sort of shared online yet. So we used some FOF Patreon funding, thank you guys, to order Fighting in Villages, which Rob, I mentioned it to Rob, and Rob said, if it's a reasonable price, you know, we should just order it, and because I want to see it, and I was very much on board with that. So we've gotten that ordered.
So watch this space for me and Matt will do a follow-up episode if we get that within a few weeks. So I think that'd be real fun.
I'm excited to see how the British Army on the Rhine would have held them off in a village.
Law 80s from the top of church
I'm expecting to see like lots of sort of the stuff that was learnt during World War II. So they would build sangers inside the bottom of buildings and sandbag doors.
Fibula for the 80s.
It is. That's exactly it. And, you know, putting planks with nails in.
You just want a Soviet trooper to get a chest full of 9mm from a Sterling, don't you? That's what you want.
I do. And I just want to see like 80s British Army on the Rhine, Home Alone. That's what I'm hoping for.
Thanks so much, Kenton, for joining us. And of course, as we've said all the way through, if you're in any way interested in this period of the British Army, then Kenton's book will be the one for you. Be out by the end of the month, so keep an eye out for that. And we'll put a link up when it does go live. So Kenton, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, guys.
I've been looking forward to doing this episode for such a long time. So I was so pleased that we finally got it together, and it's been as good as I'd hoped it would be. I really enjoyed it.
So as always, don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the podcast, give us a review on wherever you're listening on, and you can support us on Patreon as well. And you find all those links on our Twitter and our website at fightingonfilm.com. So thanks everyone again, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening.
Bye everybody.